Marcus walked into the boutique without a second thought, his mind on nothing more than browsing the racks of clothes. But as he reached for a jacket, he felt the weight of eyes on him, watching, judging. When the store manager, Mr. Daniels, approached with suspicion in his voice, Marcus knew exactly what was coming. What he didn't know was how much this moment would change both of their lives forever. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where people browsed more than bought. The boutique was one of those upscale stores where the smell of leather and expensive perfume lingered in the air. Marcus, a 17-year-old African-American boy, stepped inside with a sense of curiosity. He wasn't particularly interested in fashion, but something about the window display had caught his eye. He admired the clean lines of the jacket he spotted, imagining how it would feel on his shoulders, the fit perfect for his tall, athletic frame. From the moment he entered, Mr. Daniels, the store manager, had been watching him. He didn't mean to come off as suspicious, but something in his mind clicked the moment Marcus walked in. Dressed in a hoodie and sneakers, Marcus didn't fit the profile of their usual clientele, wealthy, older, and predominantly white. Daniels tried to shake off the feeling, but as Marcus moved deeper into the store, casually flipping through racks, his unease grew. Was the boy here to cause trouble? Marcus, unaware of the scrutiny he was under, picked up the jacket he had noticed earlier. The price tag made him chuckle under his breath. He could afford it easily thanks to his dad's wealth. Still, Marcus had never flaunted his money. He liked to keep a low profile, despite being the son of a famous athlete who had made headlines more times than Marcus could count. He wasn't here to buy, just to browse, to enjoy the peace of anonymity. But peace wasn't something Marcus could hold on to for long. As he slung the jacket over his arm to inspect another item, he noticed a shift in the store's atmosphere. He wasn't alone. Mr. Daniels had moved closer, pretending to tidy up a nearby display, but his eyes were locked onto Marcus with a narrowed suspicion. "Can I help you with something?" Daniels' voice came out cold, lacking the friendliness he had extended to the other customers earlier. Marcus glanced up, confused by the tone. "No, I'm just looking, thanks." But Daniels didn't move. His gaze lingered on the jacket draped over Marcus's arm. "If you're not going to buy that, I'd prefer if you left it on the rack." Marcus blinked, trying to process the comment. He had every right to be in the store, to look at whatever he wanted. He let out a slow breath, trying to keep calm. "I haven't decided yet, I'm just browsing." Daniels didn't back down. "I'm going to have to ask you to hand it over," he said, his voice growing more insistent. At this point, a few of the other customers were starting to take notice. Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, embarrassment mixing with frustration. He looked around, seeing that others were free to browse, to touch items without being questioned. But he knew what was happening. He'd been through it before. He'd felt those eyes follow him, those voices lower when he entered a space like this. The unspoken question, what's he doing here? "I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Why are you treating me like this?" Daniels crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "I've been watching you. You're acting suspicious, and I have to protect my business." The words hit Marcus hard, like a punch to the gut. Suspicious? For what? For looking at clothes? He shook his head in disbelief. Suspicious because of how I look? Because I'm black? The accusation hung in the air between them. Daniels stiffened, but he didn't back down. "It's not about that. It's about your behavior. You're acting like you're up to something." Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not out of violence but out of sheer frustration. He was tired of this. Tired of always being seen through the same lens. He could feel the stares from other customers now too. Some sympathetic, others just curious about the unfolding drama. "I'm not up to anything," Marcus said quietly. "I just came to look at a jacket." Daniels wasn't listening. "I'm going to ask you to leave," he said, "before this becomes a bigger issue." Marcus stared at him, the injustice of it all sinking in. He had done nothing but exist in a space where people like him were viewed as a threat. He thought about his father, about all the times they had talked about moments like this. "Don't give them a reason," his dad would always say. But what reason had he given? With a deep breath, Marcus turned, ready to leave the store, feeling the weight of all the eyes on him. But just as he reached the door, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the boutique. Marcus paused, his heart sinking. It was his dad. Of all the times for him to show up. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall, imposing figure in a tailored suit. Marcus's father, a former professional athlete turned businessman, exuded confidence and authority. As soon as Daniels saw him, his face paled. He recognized the man immediately. Everyone did. The manager's expression faltered as Marcus's father walked toward the entrance. He glanced between Marcus and his father, the realization of his mistake dawning slowly and painfully. "Marcus," his father said, his voice low and calm, though Marcus could sense the tension behind it. "What's going on?" Before Marcus could answer, Daniels, in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, stammered, "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Marcus's father asked, his tone dangerously quiet. Daniels swallowed hard. "I thought..." "You thought my son was here to steal something?" His father finished for him, his voice heavy with disappointment. Marcus looked down at the ground, the sting of the situation too sharp to face head-on. He had been humiliated, accused, and profiled, and now, even with his father's presence, the damage was done. Without another word, Marcus's father placed a hand on his shoulder and guided him out of the store. As they walked away, Marcus didn't look back. He didn't need to see Daniel's face to know what he was feeling. The encounter had exposed more than just a moment of prejudice. It had revealed a deeper issue, one that Marcus knew all too well. As they drove away, Marcus stared out the window, the weight of the incident pressing down on him. His father sat in silence, but Marcus knew they would have to talk about this eventually, about how no matter how successful, famous, or wealthy they were, some people would always see them the same way. And that hurt more than anything. The car ride home was thick with silence. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, staring out of the window, but his mind was racing. The incident in the store kept replaying in his head. The manager's accusatory stare, the way the other customers had looked at him, and worst of all, the final realization that no matter who he was or what his father had accomplished, he would always be seen as just another suspect in the eyes of people like Mr. Daniels. His father, too, was quiet, gripping the steering wheel tightly. They had been through moments like this before, though none had played out quite so publicly. Marcus could feel the storm brewing inside his father, though. He had seen that look on his face when they left the store. The anger just beneath the surface, tightly controlled but ready to erupt at any moment. But for now, his father was holding it in, waiting for the right time to address it. When they pulled into the driveway of their large, secluded home, Marcus wasn't sure what to expect. They both got out of the car, and as soon as the front door closed behind them, the silence was shattered. "Marcus," his father started, his voice heavy with frustration. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" Marcus dropped his backpack onto the floor and leaned against the wall, still trying to process everything. "I didn't want to make a scene, Dad. I just wanted to get out of there." His father paced across the living room, running a hand over his shaved head. "You didn't want to make a scene?" he echoed. "Marcus, that man accused you of stealing. He profiled you, and you just walked away like it was nothing." "It's not nothing," Marcus muttered, but his voice was small. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His father wasn't wrong, but it was more complicated than that. Marcus had learned to pick his battles, and today he had chosen to walk away. His father stopped pacing and looked at him, eyes filled with both anger and hurt. "I've worked my entire life to give you a better one, so you don't have to go through what I did. I fought through this stuff in my career, Marcus, so you wouldn't have to." Marcus felt the familiar sting of those words. He knew his father had faced his own battles with prejudice as a young athlete trying to break into the professional world. His father's success hadn't come easily, and he had always been vocal about the challenges he faced. But that was the thing. No matter how successful he had become, the world hadn't changed as much as they hoped it would. "I get it, Dad," Marcus said, his voice growing firmer. "I know what you've been through. But it's not like I can just stop people from thinking the way they do. I'm not you. I can't fight every battle. His father's face softened at that, and he let out a long sigh. He sat down on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. I just hate seeing you go through this. It makes me feel like all the work I did to get here didn't matter. It matters, Marcus said, sitting down next to him. But it doesn't stop people like Mr. Daniels from seeing us the way they do. It's exhausting, Dad. I'm tired of always having to prove that I'm not what they think I am. His father nodded slowly, but the frustration still lingered. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Meanwhile, back at the store, Mr. Daniels was beginning to realize the gravity of what had just happened. After Marcus and his father left, one of the employees timidly approached him. Mr. Daniels, I think you should see this, she said, holding up her phone. The employee had recorded the entire interaction between Daniels and Marcus. In her video, it was painfully clear how wrong Daniels had been in his assumptions. His aggressive tone, his accusatory words, it was all captured in vivid detail, and it didn't look good. What are you going to do with that? Daniels asked, suddenly feeling a wave of panic. I wasn't the only one filming, she said quietly. It's already on social media. Daniels felt his stomach drop. He took the phone from her hands and scrolled through the comments on the post. It had only been online for a few minutes, but it was already gaining traction. Dozens of comments, all condemning him, calling him out for racial profiling, for treating Marcus like a criminal just because of his appearance. This can't be happening, Daniels whispered to himself, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. His reputation, his job, it was all at risk now. He had made a mistake, and it was already spiraling out of control. By the next morning, the video had gone viral. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as another example of racial profiling in high-end stores. People were outraged, and the boutique was now under fire for the actions of its manager. The store's corporate office called Daniels in for a meeting, and within hours he was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The store had to issue a public apology, but the damage was done. Customers began boycotting the boutique, protesting outside the store, demanding accountability. Daniels's name was now associated with discrimination, and he could feel his entire career unraveling before his eyes. At home, Daniels's wife was furious. How could you let this happen? She asked, pacing the kitchen while their two children sat at the table, too young to fully understand what was going on. Do you know what this is going to do to us? To our family? I didn't mean for it to get this far, Daniels said, his voice low. I thought I was protecting the store. Protecting it from what? She snapped. From a kid looking at clothes? You've always had this thing about people like him. I just never thought it would go this far. Daniels couldn't argue with her. He had always been wary of certain customers, always quick to assume the worst when it came to young black men in the store. But now those assumptions had destroyed everything. His job, his reputation, even his marriage was on the brink of collapse. As Daniels sat alone later that night, scrolling through the hateful messages flooding his social media accounts, he couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. He had acted on impulse, on fear, on prejudice, and now he was paying the price. For Marcus, the fallout was different. While the media and social networks rallied around him, calling out the injustice of what had happened, Marcus felt hollow. He didn't want to be the face of this story. He didn't want to be the symbol of what was wrong with society. He just wanted to be a regular teenager, to live his life without constantly having to navigate a world that saw him as a threat. He watched as the video of the incident racked up millions of views. Messages of support poured in, but with them came the burden of being thrust into the spotlight. People were calling for change, for Marcus to speak out, to lead the charge against racial profiling. But all Marcus wanted was peace. His father, however, saw this as an opportunity, a chance to make a real impact, to fight for change on a larger scale. "This is your moment, Marcus," he said one evening as they sat in the living room, the news playing softly in the background. "You can use this to make a difference." But Marcus wasn't so sure. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be a symbol of anything. He wasn't sure if he could handle the pressure of being the voice for others who had faced the same discrimination. The weight of it all felt too much. "I don't know if I want this, Dad." Marcus said quietly. "I just want to live my life. I don't want to be the kid everyone looks at because of what happened in some store." His father sighed, understanding the complexity of what Marcus was feeling. "I get it, but you have a platform now, son. You can use it for good." Marcus didn't respond. He knew his father meant well, but he wasn't ready for what that meant. He wasn't ready to be the face of a movement he never asked to be part of. For now, all he could do was try to navigate the storm that had erupted around him, hoping that somehow, some way, he could find peace in the aftermath of it all. For Mr. Daniels, the days that followed the incident felt like a slow unraveling. It had only been a few days since he had been placed on administrative leave, but it felt like a lifetime. He had built his career over the years with pride, climbing his way up to the position of store manager in one of the most prestigious boutiques in the region. Now, all of that was at risk because of a single moment. A moment he couldn't take back. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the headlines on his phone. Each article painted the same damning picture. Store manager accused of racial profiling. The comments underneath were worse, people condemning him, calling him every name under the sun. There were hundreds, no thousands of people now calling for his resignation, for justice, for change. They were using his name as a symbol of everything wrong with the world. Daniels clenched his jaw, tossing the phone onto the table with frustration. How had it come to this? All he had been trying to do was protect the store, protect its image, its reputation. It was his job to make sure nothing happened under his watch. And yet, deep down, as the days passed and the uproar continued, a gnawing feeling began to creep into his thoughts. What if he had been wrong? The thought terrified him. He had always considered himself a good person. He had never been overtly discriminatory, or so he believed. But in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to be honest, he started to question everything, his assumptions, his biases, and what had led him to make that decision about Marcus in the first place. It wasn't long before the corporate office called him in for a meeting. As he walked into the building, the cold, sterile environment only heightened his anxiety. He knew this meeting would determine his future. He sat in the conference room, his palms sweating, as two representatives from the corporate office entered. The air was thick with tension. "Mr. Daniels," one of the representatives started, adjusting his glasses and flipping open a folder, "we've been reviewing the incident at the store, and after an internal investigation, we've come to the conclusion that your actions have put the store and the company in a very precarious position." Daniels felt a lump form in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, nodding slowly as the representative continued. "We've received a tremendous amount of backlash, not just locally but nationally. This incident has sparked a conversation about racial profiling and discrimination, and frankly, it's a conversation we wish we weren't at the center of," the representative continued. "We've reviewed the footage as well as your previous record with the company, and while we don't believe you acted out of overt malice, there is a pattern here that we can no longer ignore." Daniels's heart sank. He had worked at the store for years, and now they were talking about patterns? He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He knew what they were talking about. He had seen the uncomfortable looks from certain employees when he would tell them to keep an eye on certain customers. He had heard the murmurings when he had been a bit too quick to assume the worst about certain people who walked through the door. He had ignored it all, chalking it up to being cautious, to protecting the store. But now it was all catching up to him. The other representative, a woman with a firm but not unkind expression, spoke next. "We've decided that it's in the best interest of both the store and yourself to part ways. We'll offer you a severance package, and we strongly recommend that you participate in a diversity and inclusion program that we will fund as part of this arrangement." Daniels's head swam with the implications of what she was saying. His career, the life he had built, was over. And yet, it was that last sentence that stuck with him the most. A diversity and inclusion program? He had always seen those kinds of programs as unnecessary, something designed for people who didn't understand the world. He had always thought of himself as fair, as someone who didn't need to be told how to treat people. But now, sitting there, staring at the faces of the representatives who were calmly dismantling his career, he realized that maybe he wasn't as fair as he thought. Maybe there was something in him, something he had never examined, that had led him to this moment. He had acted out of a place he didn't fully understand. He left the building in a daze, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His thoughts swirled as he drove home, wondering how he was going to explain this to his family. His wife had already been furious after the initial fallout, but now, with no job and a future hanging in the balance, he didn't know how they were going to recover. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw his wife sitting on the porch, her arms crossed. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of frustration and concern. "How did it go?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Daniels sighed, sitting down next to her. "I lost my job," he said, the words feeling heavy and final. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I told you this was going to happen. You've always had this thing about certain people, and now it's come back to bite you." Daniels didn't have the energy to argue. He knew she was right, even if he didn't want to admit it out loud. "They want me to take some diversity training," he said, staring out at the street. "Can you believe that?" His wife glanced at him, her eyebrows raised. "Actually, yeah, I can." Daniels frowned, not expecting her to agree so quickly. She continued, "You've been blind to this for a long time, Jack. I've told you before that you treat people differently based on how they look, but you never listened. Maybe now, after everything that's happened, you'll finally start paying attention." Her words stung, but deep down, Daniels knew she was right. He had ignored the signs for too long, dismissed the little voice in the back of his head that told him he was acting out of bias. He had never thought of himself as prejudiced. But maybe it wasn't about what he thought of himself. Maybe it was about how his actions affected others, people like Marcus. A few days later, Daniels reluctantly agreed to attend the diversity and inclusion training program. It wasn't optional, and even though he resented the idea, a part of him was curious. What exactly could they teach him that he didn't already know? He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't a racist, at least not in the overt, hateful way he saw on the news. So what was there to learn? The first session was eye-opening. The facilitator, a woman named Leah, was calm and patient, but she didn't shy away from uncomfortable truths. She began by explaining implicit bias, how everyone, no matter how well-meaning, carried unconscious prejudices that influenced their actions. It wasn't about being a good or bad person, she explained. It was about recognizing the biases that shaped the way people saw the world and then working to unlearn them. Daniels listened, at first with skepticism, but then with growing awareness. As Leah described situations where people acted on assumptions without realizing it, he saw himself in her words. The way he had watched Marcus from the moment he walked into the store, the assumptions he had made without any real evidence, the way he had treated Marcus differently than he would have treated someone else, it all started to make sense. By the end of the session, Daniels felt drained but also enlightened in a way he hadn't expected. He had never thought of himself as part of the problem, but now he saw how his actions had contributed to a much larger issue. He began attending more sessions, each one peeling back layers of his assumptions. He learned about the history of racial profiling, about the long-lasting impact of systemic discrimination, and most importantly, about how people like him, people who thought they were just doing their jobs, could perpetuate harm without realizing it. The training sessions led Daniels to start thinking about Marcus in a new light. He had spent weeks angry at himself for losing his job, angry at Marcus for being the catalyst of it all. But now, as he reflected on what he had learned, he realized that Marcus hadn't done anything wrong. Marcus had simply been a young man trying to shop, and Daniels had been the one who brought all of his biases to that interaction. One evening, after another day of training, Daniels sat down and wrote a letter to Marcus. He wasn't sure if Marcus would ever read it, but he needed to put his thoughts on paper. In the letter, Daniels apologized, not just for accusing Marcus of theft, but for everything that had come before. He admitted that he had acted out of bias, that he had judged Marcus unfairly, and that he was working to understand and change those biases. It It was the most difficult letter he had ever written, but also the most necessary. He mailed it the next day, feeling a sense of closure as he dropped the envelope into the mailbox. Whether or not Marcus responded, Daniels knew he had taken the first step toward redemption, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own. The letter arrived at Marcus's house on a cold, overcast afternoon. It was unremarkable, a plain white envelope with his name scribbled on it in unfamiliar handwriting. He almost tossed it into the pile of mail his father usually sorted through. But something about it made him stop. There was no return address, no indication of where it had come from. His curiosity piqued. Marcus ripped it open and scanned the first few lines. His stomach tightened as he read the signature at the bottom. Mr. Daniels. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen in the foyer, staring at the letter as if it were some kind of strange artifact from a life he had long left behind. He hadn't heard from Mr. Daniels since the incident at the boutique weeks ago, hadn't even thought about him much since the media frenzy had died down. Life had started to feel somewhat normal again, but the letter brought it all rushing back. The store, the accusations, the humiliation. He considered crumpling it up, throwing it away without a second thought. But then, after a deep breath, he walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and started reading it again from the beginning. In the letter, Mr. Daniels apologized, profusely. He explained how the incident had forced him to confront the biases he had never acknowledged. He wrote about attending diversity and inclusion training, about how he was learning to unlearn the prejudices he hadn't even realized he carried. He admitted that what he did to Marcus was wrong, deeply wrong, and that he understood if Marcus didn't want to forgive him, but he wanted Marcus to know that he was trying to be better. As Marcus finished reading, a whirlwind of emotions stirred inside him. Anger, disbelief, but also something more complicated, something that made him pause. He stood up from the table, the letter still in hand, and walked into the living room where his father was sitting, reading the newspaper. "Dad," Marcus said, holding out the letter. "Look at this." His father took the letter, his brow furrowing as he recognized the name at the bottom. He read it silently, his expression hardening with each sentence. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "So now he's sorry?" his father muttered, tossing the letter onto the coffee table. "After everything, he wants to apologize?" Marcus nodded, unsure of how to respond. His father had been furious after the incident, calling for accountability and even considering legal action against the store. The viral video had led to a flurry of media attention, and while it had sparked important conversations about racial profiling, it had also drained them both emotionally. They were just beginning to move past it, and now this letter had brought it all back to the surface. "What are you going to do?" his father asked, his tone still edged with frustration. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know. I mean, it's weird. I wasn't expecting this." His father leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "You don't owe him anything, Marcus. Just because he's having some epiphany doesn't mean you have to accept his apology. People like him, they don't change overnight. Don't let him off the hook so easily." Marcus nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew his father was right. People didn't change overnight. But something about the letter gnawed at him. Maybe it was the sincerity in Mr. Daniels's words, or maybe it was the simple fact that he had reached out at all. Later that night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The letter was still on his mind. He kept thinking about what Mr. Daniels had written about attending those training sessions, about learning to unlearn his biases. That even possible? Could someone like Mr. Daniels really change? The truth was, Marcus didn't want to think about Mr. Daniels. He wanted to move on, to live his life, without being haunted by what had happened in that store. But now it seemed like Mr. Daniels was trying to make amends, trying to start a conversation that Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to have. The next day, Marcus found himself standing in front of a community center he had never been to before. It was where Mr. Daniels had mentioned attending his training sessions. Marcus wasn't sure why he had come. Maybe part of him wanted to see if Daniels was serious about changing, or maybe he just wanted to understand what this training was all about. As he walked inside, he was greeted by the facilitator, Leah, who welcomed him warmly. She had no idea who he was or why he was there, and Marcus preferred it that way. He sat quietly in the back of the room as the session began. The topic that day was implicit bias, a concept Marcus was all too familiar with. Leah explained how biases were formed, how people, even with the best intentions, could carry subconscious prejudices that affected the way they treated others. She talked about how these biases often went unrecognized, but had profound effects on the lives of those who were on the receiving end of them. As Marcus listened, he found himself nodding along. He had experienced everything she was talking about firsthand: how people crossed the street when they saw him walking, how clerks followed him in stores, how teachers assumed he wasn't capable of certain things because of his race. He understood all of it. But what struck him was how Leah spoke about unlearning those biases. She made it clear that it wasn't a quick fix, that it required constant self-reflection and effort. But she also said that it was possible. For the first time, Marcus began to wonder if maybe Mr. Daniels was sincere. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to change. And if that was true, didn't that count for something? A week later, Marcus found himself back at the community center, this time not as an observer, but as a participant. Leah had invited him to share his story with the group, and after some hesitation, Marcus agreed. He didn't want to talk about the incident, but he realized that if people were going to learn, they needed to hear from someone who had lived through it. As he stood in front of the group, Marcus's voice shook slightly at first, but then he found his rhythm. He told them about the day in the store, about how he had been treated, about how humiliating it had been to be seen as a criminal just because of how he looked. He told them about the assumptions people made about him every day, how he was constantly fighting to prove that he wasn't what they thought he was. The room was silent as he spoke, and when he finished, Leah thanked him for his honesty. The group had a long discussion afterward, and Marcus was surprised by how many people admitted to having biases they hadn't recognized before. They talked about how those biases affected their decisions, their actions, their interactions with people who looked different from them. After the session, Leah approached Marcus with a smile. "You did really well today," she said. "It's not easy to share your story like that." Marcus shrugged, but he smiled back. "It was different, but I think it helped." Leah nodded. "You know, Mr. Daniels has been coming to these sessions for weeks now. He's been quiet, but I can see that he's learning. It's not easy to face the things we don't want to see in ourselves, but he's trying." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. The fact that Mr. Daniels was here, learning, was still hard for him to process. But the fact that he was trying, it was something Marcus hadn't expected. The next day, Marcus received an email from Mr. Daniels. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but it was enough to make Marcus stop and think. "Marcus, I heard you spoke at the session yesterday. I wanted to thank you for sharing your experience. I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, for myself and for others. If you're ever willing to talk, I'd like the chance to apologize in person." Marcus stared at the email for a long time. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that conversation, but something inside him had shifted. Mr. Daniels wasn't the man he had thought he was, or at least, he wasn't anymore. For the first time, Marcus began to consider the possibility of forgiveness, not for Mr. Daniels' sake, but for his own. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus felt a heaviness in his chest as he sat in his room, staring at his phone. He had read Mr. Daniels' email over and over again since it had arrived, each time feeling a different swirl of emotions. Part of him still felt the raw sting of the injustice he had faced in that store. The humiliation, the assumption that he was there to do something wrong. It all haunted him. But another part of him, the quieter part, was beginning to see the situation through a more complex lens. He hadn't responded to Mr. Daniels right away. It took days of thinking, pacing his room, and even a couple of long conversations with his father before he finally decided what he was going to do. The decision hadn't come easily. His father, though supportive, was wary. He didn't trust people like Daniels, and he made no secret of it. But Marcus wasn't sure if he wanted to carry that weight forever. Now, sitting there in the late afternoon sunlight filtering through his window, Marcus felt a sense of finality. He had agreed to meet Mr. Daniels, but not at the community center. He had chosen a more neutral location, a quiet park in the middle of town. It was a place that felt removed from the chaos of the incident, from the store, from everything. When Marcus arrived at the park, the autumn air was crisp, and the trees were beginning to turn shades of gold and red. He spotted Mr. Daniels sitting on a bench near a pond, his hands clasped together nervously. Marcus hesitated for a moment, watching him from a distance. The man looked older, more worn out than Marcus remembered. The stress of the past few months had clearly taken its toll on him. Finally, Marcus took a deep breath and walked over. Mr. Daniels looked up as he approached, standing awkwardly as Marcus came to a stop in front of him. "Marcus," Mr. Daniels said, his voice hesitant but respectful. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you'd want to meet." Marcus nodded, not quite ready to sit down yet. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted, his voice steady but guarded. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between them. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything unsaid. He wasn't sure what he had expected from this meeting, but now that he was here, he wasn't entirely sure where to begin. Mr. Daniels broke the silence first, his voice low and remorseful. "I want to start by saying that I'm truly sorry, Marcus. I've said it in the letter, and I've said it in the sessions, but I want to say it to your face. What I did that day was wrong. I judged you based on assumptions that I shouldn't have made. I hurt you, and I hurt myself in the process. I've had to face a lot of hard truths since that day." Marcus looked down at the ground, his hands shoved in his pockets. He had heard apologies before, empty words from people who didn't really understand the harm they had caused. But something about the way Mr. Daniels spoke felt different. The sincerity in his voice wasn't something Marcus could easily dismiss. "I've been going to the diversity training," Mr. Daniels continued, "and it's been eye-opening. I didn't realize how much of my life was shaped by these biases, these things I didn't even know I was carrying. I can't undo what I did, but I'm committed to changing, Marcus. I'm trying to be better. I want to be better." Marcus finally looked up, meeting Mr. Daniels' eyes for the first time since arriving. He could see the weight of regret in them, but also something else. Determination. The man in front of him wasn't the same person who had stood in that store, accusing him of theft. This man seemed broken in a way, but also more aware, more reflective. "I didn't come here for an apology," Marcus said slowly, his voice carefully measured. "I've heard enough apologies in my life. What I want to know is, why should I believe you're really going to change? Why should I trust you won't just go back to the way you were before?" Mr. Daniels nodded, as if expecting the question. "You shouldn't trust me. Not right away, at least. Trust isn't something I can ask for. It's something I have to earn. And I know I've got a long way to go before I can even think about earning it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The truth is, I've had to confront some ugly things about myself. I've had to admit that the way I treated you wasn't an isolated incident. I've made assumptions about people before, and I've let those assumptions guide how I treat them. I didn't even realize how deep those biases went until I started attending the sessions and really listening. But I'm working on it, Marcus. Every day, I'm trying to unlearn what I've spent years absorbing." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt the weight of their meaning. It wasn't the first time he had heard someone talk about unlearning prejudice, but it was the first time it felt like someone was genuinely willing to do the work. Marcus sat down on the bench next to Mr. Daniels, still keeping a slight distance between them. He stared out at the pond, the surface of the water reflecting the golden leaves of the trees around it. "You know," Marcus said after a long pause, "I've spent my whole life dealing with people who look at me like I'm up to something. It's exhausting. And it's not just about the way you treated me in that store. It's about the way the world treats people who look like me. The way we're always seen as a threat. I'm tired of it, man. Tired of always having to prove I'm not what they think I am." Mr. Daniels nodded, his expression somber. "I know. I mean, I don't know firsthand what that feels like, but I've been learning about it. I've been listening to stories from people who've experienced the same thing you have. And it's heartbreaking. I don't want to be a part of that anymore. I want to be part of the solution." Marcus sighed, feeling the tightness in his chest slowly begin to loosen. He had been carrying the weight of that day in the store for so long, but hearing Mr. Daniels acknowledge the larger issue, how it wasn't just about one incident but about the way society treated people like him, made Marcus feel like maybe they could have a real conversation. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Marcus admitted quietly, his voice soft but honest. "Not yet, anyway. But I can appreciate that you're trying. And maybe that's enough for now." Mr. Daniels exhaled, a mixture of relief and understanding in his expression. "That's all I can ask for. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm grateful that you were willing to meet with me. It means a lot." They sat in silence for a while after that, watching the ducks glide across the pond. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was a start. And for Marcus, that felt like enough. He didn't need to forgive Mr. Daniels right away. He didn't need to forget what had happened in that store. But he could move forward, even if only a little. Over the next few months, Marcus continued to speak at the community center, sharing his story with more people, helping others understand the impact of racial profiling and discrimination. His father had been hesitant at first, unsure if Marcus should take on the role of an advocate. But as he watched his son grow more confident, more determined, he realized that this was something Marcus needed to do, not just for himself, but for others who had experienced the same pain. Marcus also began working on a project that had been in the back of his mind for some time. With the settlement money from the store, he founded an organization dedicated to educating young people about racial bias, prejudice, and the importance of empathy. He partnered with local schools and community leaders, creating workshops and programs that focused on fostering understanding and inclusivity. Mr. Daniels, true to his word, became one of the volunteers at the organization. He attended the events, listened to the stories, and continued his own journey of learning and growth. He didn't try to insert himself into the spotlight. Instead, he worked quietly in the background, helping where he could, always aware that he had a long way to go. One evening, after a successful event at a local school, Marcus stood in front of a group of students, looking out at their faces. He spoke with confidence now, no longer the uncertain teenager who had once walked into a boutique and been judged before he even had a chance to speak. "I've learned something important over the past year," Marcus said, his voice steady and clear. "It's that change doesn't happen overnight. People don't just wake up one day and decide to be different. It takes work, it takes effort, but most importantly, it takes a willingness to see the world through someone else's eyes." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There's no easy fix for prejudice, no magic solution that makes it go away. But I believe that if we're willing to listen, to learn, and to challenge our own assumptions, we can make things better. It won't happen all at once, but every small step counts." As the students clapped, Marcus smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. He had found a way to move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by using it to create a better future. And that, he realized, was the real power of healing. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.